Elena Vance had mastered the intricate art of remaining invisible. It was a particular thing. It had edges and a temperature of its own, much like the frost that bloomed against the single-paned window of her attic room. In the high, slanting shadows of the Beaumont estate's servant quarters, she sat with her shoulders hunched against the draught, her fingers moving with a rhythmic, frantic precision that defied the chill. On her lap lay the sarcenet gown, a garment she had rescued from a dusty corner of a village thrift shop for exactly $10. To anyone else, it was a discarded relic of a previous decade, its hem frayed and its color a muted, apologetic gray. But under Elena's hands, it was becoming something else entirely. She was not merely mending it. She was breathing life into its tired fibers with a needle that felt like an extension of her own bone. The attic was silent, save for the faint, rhythmic rasp of the thread pulling through the silk. This was the labor of restoration, a quiet defiance against the penury that had defined her 20 years of existence. She worked by the light of a single, guttering candle, its flame dancing in the drafts that snaked through the floorboards. The embroidery she was currently executing was not the standard floral patterns found in the ladies' magazines. It was a complex, swirling architecture of silver thread, a technique involving minute split stitches and hidden knots that created a texture so dense it seemed to shimmer with a light of its own. It was a skill her mother, Clara, had taught her in the dead of night, whispered like a prayer or a dangerous secret. A soft creak sounded at the door, and Clara Vance stepped into the room. She was still wearing her heavy woolmaid's uniform, the dark fabric dusted with the flour of the kitchens and the faint scent of beeswax polish. Her face was a map of quiet resilience, the lines around her eyes deepened by 3 decades of looking at the floor while the powerful walked by. She stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her daughter. There was a profound, melancholic hope in her gaze, the kind of look one gives to a fragile sapling planted in a field of stones. Clara did not speak of love or pride. Instead, she spoke of the work. "You have the tension too tight on the left sleeve, Elena," her mother murmured, her voice like the dry rustle of parchment. "The silk will pucker when you move. You must listen for the water, not the wheel. If the thread resists, it is because you are forcing the story." Elena paused, her needle suspended in the amber candlelight. She took a slow, steady breath, feeling the exact temperature of the silence between them. It was a silence filled with the weight of things unsaid, of a heritage buried under layers of domestic service and the crushing anonymity of the working class. With a deft flick of her wrist, Elena loosened the stitch, and the fabric relaxed, settling against her knee like a sigh. Clara moved closer, her calloused hand reaching into the hidden pocket of her apron. She pulled out a small, rectangular object wrapped in a scrap of stained linen. As she unwrapped it, the smell of old cedar and iron gall ink filled the cramped space. It was a letter, the parchment yellowed with age and sealed with a heavy, dark red wax. The seal bore a crest that Elena recognized with a jolt of recognition, the twin lions of the Beaumont lineage, intertwined with a sprig of wild lavender. This was not a common document. It was a relic of a different era, carrying the authority of a house that had stood for 4 centuries. "Your grandmother gave this to me when the light was fading from her eyes," Clara said, her voice dropping to a whisper that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. "She told me it was a legacy of honor, a debt that could only be paid when the right hands held the needle. She was the Duchess Eleanor's closest confidant, though the world saw only a woman who changed the linens. Tonight, you go to the gala not as a guest but as a messenger. You will find the Duke. You will ensure this reaches his hand, and no other. The wolves will be there, Elena. They will look at your cheap clothes, and they will see a girl who belongs in the shadows. Let them. The bones of this house are held together by more than gold." Elena took the letter, the weight of it surprising her. It felt heavy, as if the ink itself were made of lead. She tucked it into the hidden pocket she had sewn into the lining of the grey sarcenet gown, right against her ribs. She felt the sharp edge of the parchment through her chemise, a constant reminder of the stakes. This was not just about a dress or a party. It was about the restoration of a truth that had been systematically erased by the social coldness of the elite. She stood up, the grey silk falling around her in a shimmering cascade. In the dim light, the silver embroidery seemed to pulse, a hidden map of a heritage that no amount of mockery could truly touch. The transition from the dusty, light-starved attic to the grand carriage porch of the Beaumont estate was a sensory assault. Elena stepped out of the hired gig, a humble, rattling thing that smelled of damp straw, and into a world of blinding gold and shifting silk. The estate was a limestone titan, its windows glowing like amber lanterns against the velvet purple of the evening sky. The air here was different. It was thick with the scent of expensive hothouse lilies, Moroccan leather, and the metallic tang of wealth. As she ascended the wide stone steps, her $10 dress felt like a smudge of ash on a pristine white canvas. She could feel the weight of her poverty in the way the air didn't seem to want to move around her. The grand foyer was a cathedral of excess. Marble floors polished to a mirror finish reflected the dizzying light of 3 massive crystal chandeliers. Everywhere Elena looked, there was the rustle of $1,000,000 silk, satin that flowed like water, velvet as deep as a bruise, and lace so fine it looked like captured frost. The women moved in a cloud of perfume and quiet arrogance, their diamonds catching the light with a predatory sharpness. Elena kept her head up, her gaze fixed on the middle distance, practicing the quiet discipline of fading into the background. She was a ghost in a palace of glass, moving through a crowd that looked through her as if she were a pillar of smoke. Near the grand staircase, she caught the eyes of the staff. These were her mother's colleagues, men and women who spent their lives mending the finery of the people who now ignored them. She saw a footman in a stiff, gold-braided livery pause for a fraction of a second as she passed, his eyes widening as they swept over the embroidery on her hem. A maid, carrying a tray of crystal flutes filled with pale, bubbling wine, tightened her grip on the silver handle, a look of profound, terrified pride flitting across her weary face. They knew. They recognized the split stitch, the hidden knots, and the silver thread that shouldn't exist in a world of cheap imitations. To them, Elena was a signal fire in the dark. The ballroom beckoned, a cavernous space of gilded mirrors and orchestral swells that vibrated in Elena's very marrow. The music was a wall of sound, a sophisticated mask for the gossip and the cruelty that thrived in the corners of the room. As she crossed the threshold, the social frost hit her. She saw the way heads turned, not in admiration, but in the clinical observation of a flaw. She heard the hushed whispers, the sharp staccato laughs that were designed to exclude. They looked at her cheap clothes and saw an intruder, a maid's daughter who had dared to step out of the shadows. But Elena felt the weight of the letter against her heart and the cold, steady strength of the silver thread beneath her fingers. She was not a guest, and she was not a victim. She was the architect of a restoration they could not yet imagine. The sensory details of the room began to blur into a singular, overwhelming texture. The gritty feel of the stone under her slippers, the smell of burnt beeswax from the 1,000 candles, and the exact temperature of the silence that followed her as she moved toward the buffet. She was looking for him. She was looking for the man whose family had built this monument to legacy, and whose mother had entrusted her secrets to a woman in a wool apron. Somewhere in this sea of gold and mockery, the Duke was waiting, and the letter in her pocket was a key that was about to turn in a lock that had been frozen for decades. Elena straightened her spine, the grey sarcenet rustling softly, and prepared to be seen for the very first time. The buffet table was a sprawling landscape of aristocratic excess, a kingdom of glazed venison, sugar sculptures, and tiered silver platters that groaned under the weight of hothouse grapes and candied oranges. Elena Vance stood at its edge, the air smelling of cloves and expensive wine, a stark departure from the scent of damp wool and starch that defined the servant quarters. Her hand, steady despite the thrumming of her heart, reached for a small piece of bread. As her fingers brushed the polished rim of the silver tongs, she felt the contrast of her own skin, callosed and mapped with the tiny scars of 1,000 needle pricks against the smooth, unblemished surface of the wealth surrounding her. It was a sensory collision that reminded her, with every breath, that she was an intruder in a world built on the labor of women like her mother, Clara Vance. She did not look at the guests, but she heard them. They were like a flock of birds, their voices trilling with a calculated indifference that was more cutting than any scream. Elena kept her gaze fixed on the tablecloth, a heavy damask that felt like iron compared to the delicate sarcenet of her gown. She was practicing the art of the middle distance, focusing on the way the light caught the bubbles in the crystal flutes, trying to remain as still as a statue in a garden of thorns. She had internalized the exact dimensions of invisibility. It was a matter of breathing in the spaces between others' laughter. The silence around her changed. It did not disappear, but it shifted in temperature, growing brittle and sharp. The rustle of expensive silk, the kind that cost a footman's annual salary per yard, heralded the arrival of Elena Vance. Elena did not merely walk into a space, she colonized it with the sheer force of her perceived importance. She was draped in sapphire satin so vibrant it seemed to bruise the air, her neck adorned with a collar of diamonds that caught the light with a predatory glint. Behind her, Lydia Vane followed like a pale, obedient shadow, her eyes narrowing as they swept over Elena's frame. "Good heavens," Celine murmured, her voice carrying that peculiar honeyed venom that only the truly privileged can master. "I thought the help had been instructed him in the kitchens until the midnight clearing. Whatever is this creature doing among the porcelain?" She paused, her gaze traveling down Elena's body with a slow, clinical disdain. The silence in the immediate vicinity deepened as other guests turned, sensing the beginning of a spectacle. Elena felt the heat rise in her neck, a steady, pulsing warmth that she fought to suppress. She did not move. She simply held her breath, the legacy letter in her pocket, a hard, hidden weight against her ribs. Celine stepped closer, the scent of her jasmine perfume thick and suffocating. She reached out a gloved hand, the white kidskin stark against the muted grey of Elena's sleeve. She caught a fold of the sarcenet between her thumb and forefinger, rubbing the fabric with a look of theatrical confusion. "It is grey," she noted, as if the colour itself were a moral failing. "And the texture, Lydia, do come look. It feels like the rags Clara uses to polish the silver in the East Wing. Where on earth does one even acquire such a wretched thing? It looks like it was woven from the dust of a church basement." Lydia let out a sharp, staccato laugh that sounded like the breaking of dry twigs. "It is a costume, surely," she suggested, her eyes dancing with a cruel light. "Perhaps the girl thinks this is a masquerade and she has come as a pauper. It is quite convincing, is it not? Look at the hem, Celine. It's been mended. I can see the stitching from here, it's so earnest." Celine dropped the fabric as if it had burned her, her lip curling in a sneer that transformed her beautiful face into something ugly and small. "It isn't a costume, Lydia. It is a confession. Look at her cheap clothes. They smell of the thrift shop and the attic. Only a maid's daughter would have the audacity to wear the color of a rainy Tuesday to a Beaumont gala." Elena Vance finally looked up. Her eyes met Celine's, and for a moment the ballroom seemed to fall away, leaving only the two of them, the hunter and the hunted. Elena did not speak. She knew that any words she offered would be twisted into more ammunition for their sport. Instead, she watched Celine's face, noting the way the socialite's eyes darted toward the silver embroidery on the sleeve. For a fraction of a second, a flicker of doubt crossed Celine's features, a recognition of a skill she could not name. But it was quickly smothered by the arrogance of her station. Celine could not admit that the girl in the $10 dress possessed something she could never buy, so she chose to destroy it instead. To the circle of observers, Elena was not a person but a diversion, a brief interruption in the monotony of their evening. They saw the grey sarcenet and the humble pearls, and they agreed with the silent consensus of their class. She did not belong. The air felt heavy with their collective judgment, a social coldness that was far more piercing than the winter draft in the attic. Elena stood her ground, her spine as rigid as a limestone pillar, while Celine leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You are a stain on the floor of this house," Celine said, a common little moth trying to flutter among the eagles. "Do you really think that needlework can hide the smell of the servant quarters?" Celine reached for a crystal flute of dark, crimson wine from a passing tray, her movements fluid and practiced. The vintage was a deep, bruised red, the color of an old wound, and it caught the golden light of the candles as she swirled it in the glass. She took a deliberate step toward Elena, her sapphire skirts brushing against the grey sarcenet. The tension in the room reached a breaking point, the exact temperature of the silence now hovering at the freezing mark. Elena saw the movement before it happened, but she could not retreat. To move would be to admit defeat, to acknowledge the shame they were trying to force upon her. "Oh, how clumsy of me," Celine said, her voice devoid of any real apology. Her wrist flicked with a sharp, calculated precision, and the glass tilted. The red liquid arched through the air in a slow, shimmering curve, a splash of violence against the muted backdrop of the ballroom. It hit Elena's shoulder and chest, the liquid cold and heavy as it soaked through the sarcenet. The grey fabric darkened instantly, the deep red spreading like a growing shadow, bleeding into the delicate silver embroidery that Elena had spent 3 weeks perfecting. The scent of fermented grapes rose up, sharp and sour, clashing with the hothouse lilies of the room. The laughter that followed was not loud, but it was total. It was a ripple of sound that started with Celine and Lydia and spread through the circle of onlookers like a contagion. Celine stood back, her hand over her mouth in a mock gesture of horror. "Look at you now," she laughed, the sound sharp and crystalline. "A stained rag in a stained dress. It is much more appropriate, don't you think? You look exactly like what you are, something that belongs in the laundry room. You should go, little moth, before you ruin the carpets with your poverty." Elena Vance stood perfectly still. She could feel the dampness of the wine seeping through her chemise, the cold liquid clinging to her skin. The red stain was a public mark of her humiliation, a visual declaration of her low status that everyone in the room could read. She looked down at her chest, where the silver thread was now drowned in the dark crimson of the wine. The intricate split stitches, the hidden knots, the labor of her mother's legacy, all of it seemed to have been erased by a single petty gesture. The weight of the wine felt like the weight of the entire world, pressing down on her shoulders. Lydia stepped forward, her face twisted in a grin of pure malice. "Do you need a bucket, dear, or perhaps a mop? I'm sure your mother can show you how to use them. It would be a shame to leave a trail of yourself across the Duke's marble." The guests around them began to turn away, the spectacle concluded, their interest already moving on to the next amusement. They left Elena standing there, a girl in a ruined dress surrounded by the debris of their mockery. The orchestral music swelled again, a triumphant, soaring melody that felt like a mockery of her silence. Elena's hand went to the pocket where the legacy letter was hidden. She felt the sharp corner of the parchment through the wet silk, a jagged reminder of why she was here. The wine had not touched the document. It remained dry and potent, a secret flame held against her heart. She took a slow, steady breath, the air in her lungs feeling like cold iron. She did not cry. To cry would be to accept their definition of her, to agree that she was nothing more than a stained rag. Instead, she straightened her shoulders, the wet sarcenet heavy and cold, and she began to walk, not toward the exit, but deeper into the light. She moved through the crowd with a new kind of visibility. Heads turned as she passed, the red stain on her dress drawing every eye like a beacon. She could hear the whispers trailing in her wake, the words "cheap" Maid, and disgrace fluttering, like dead leaves in the wind. She felt the exact shape of their contempt, a cold draft that followed her across the marble floor. But beneath the humiliation, beneath the sting of the wine and the laughter, there was a growing clarity. They had seen her clothes, and they had mocked her mother, but they had not seen the truth. They had not seen its true structural foundation. Elena reached the center of the ballroom, under the primary chandelier where the light was most unforgiving, and she stopped. She stood in the ordinary light, soaked and shamed, and she waited for the one man who could read the map she carried. The sensory details of the room began to crystallize, the smell of the spilled wine, the texture of the stain as it began to dry, and the rhythmic thud of the orchestra that sounded like the beating of a giant's heart. Elena closed her eyes for a second, picturing the attic, the single candle, and Clara's hands. She remembered the instruction to listen for the water, not the wheel. The storm had come, and the water was rising, but she would not be swept away. She was the architect of a restoration they could not yet imagine, and as the heavy gold-braided doors at the far end of the ballroom began to open, she knew that the silence of the room was about to change one final time. A presence was moving toward the light, a figure that commanded the air with a silent, absolute authority. Elena did not look, but she felt the shift in the atmosphere, the way the laughter died and the rustle of silk ceased. Arthur Beaumont, the Duke, had arrived, and he was walking toward the stain in the center of his world. Elena Vance gripped the hidden letter one last time, her fingers cold and trembling, and prepared for the moment when the unseen would finally be witnessed by the one man who possessed the vision to understand it. Arthur Beaumont walked as if the limestone floors of the estate were merely an extension of his own skin. Instead of the hurried, performative grace of his courtiers, he moved with the slow, inevitable weight of a glacier. The air in the ballroom, previously brittle with Celine Vane's laughter, solidified into something dense and cold. As the reclusive Duke crossed the threshold of the primary chandelier's light, the music of the orchestra did not stop, but the violins faltered into a hushed, nervous tremolo that mirrored the collective heartbeat of the room. He ignored the guests who lined the perimeter like gilded statues. His gaze was fixed with a clinical, terrifying intensity on the center of the room, on the girl drenched in wine, a dark, spreading bruise of red against her grey sarcenet gown. To the elite, Elena Vance was a flaw to be excised, but to Arthur, she was a sudden, jarring chord of truth in a room full of practiced lies. He saw the way she held her chin high, her trembling fingers stilled by sheer effort of will, and the calluses of her needlework that stood as a testament to a life lived in the service of creation rather than consumption. Elena Vance straightened her spine, her sapphire satin rustling with a smug, anticipatory satisfaction. Stepping forward, her diamond collar flashing in the candlelight, she was ready to offer a honeyed explanation. "Your Grace," she began, her tone a masterclass in performative regret. "I must apologize for the interruption, this girl." She was quite clumsy with the vintage. "We were just seeing her to the exit." Celine adjusted her fan, assuming the Duke would naturally value the sanctity of his silk over the humanity of a servant. But the Duke of Beaumont did not stop. He did not even turn his head to acknowledge the daughter of the Vane family. He walked past Celine as if she were made of smoke, an insubstantial vapor to a man concerned with the core reality of the matter. The air from his heavy wool frock coat brushed against her skirts with a dismissal more profound than a physical slap. Her practiced apology died in her throat as she watched the most powerful man in the country walk directly into the circle of Elena's shame. Lydia Vane, standing behind her sister, paled, sensing a shift in the distinct, biting chill of the quiet. Arthur stopped precisely 3 feet from Elena Vance. Up close, the sharp, metallic tang of the spilled wine clashed with the expensive jasmine and lavender permeating the air. His eyes traveled over the ruined sarcenet clinging to her shivering frame, noting the humble pearls that glowed like small defiant embers against her throat. But it was not the stain that held his profound attention. It was the embroidery beneath it, the silver thread shimmering through the dark liquid. It was a map of forgotten artistry pulsing with life in the harsh light of the crystal. He saw the rhythm of the needlework, a sequence of knots and flows that spoke of a very specific royal heritage. Elena did not lower her head. Her hand gripped the legacy letter through the wet fabric of her pocket, the parchment, a small, hard secret against her thigh. She felt the precise shape of being seen. It was a scorching, heavy weight that demanded she stand her ground. She watched the Duke's jaw tighten, the architectural planes of his face becoming stark as he recognized the swirling ancestral patterns. These were the hidden knots he had not seen since the day his mother, Duchess Eleanor, had been laid to rest. The silence between them became a bridge built of silver thread and shared history. A low sound escaped Arthur's throat, carrying the weight of a decade of suppressed grief. He stepped closer, entering the space the rest of the room had treated as infected. The guests watched, their breaths held in terrified suspension as the reclusive Duke reached out. He did not touch Elena's skin. Instead, his fingers hovered just an inch above the ruined embroidery on her sleeve. He traced the invisible path of the needle that had dared to recreate the Beaumont legacy on a $10 thrifted dress. "It is impossible," he murmured, his voice a low vibration, traveling through the floorboards into the marrow of Elena's bones. He spoke not to the room, but to the thread itself, and to the immense labor it represented. The assembly fell into a state of absolute crystalline shock. They had expected him to call for the guard, to express outrage at the defilement of his ballroom. Instead, Arthur Beaumont looked at the girl in the cheap clothes, as if she were the only thing in the world that possessed a soul. A low hiss of confusion rippled through the silk and lace, like a sudden, unwelcome draught. Elena felt the coldness of the wine numbing her skin, but the heat of the Duke's gaze was an absolute shield. He was looking at the way she had mended the sarcenet, the precision of the hem, and the sheer audacity of the silver bullion thread. Because she had chosen to stand her ground, he could not stand by, while the social coldness of the elite attempted to extinguish her light. Arthur turned his head slightly, his gaze sweeping over the Vane sisters. The temperature of the room plummeted. His silence was a harsh judgment, a quiet condemnation of those who mistook material wealth for true value. Then the Duke did something that shocked the entire peerage. Arthur Beaumont reached for the silver buttons of his ceremonial coat, a heavy gold-braided garment of deep charcoal wool bearing his lineage's crest. With slow, deliberate movements, he unfastened the coat, his eyes never leaving Elena's face. Elena Vane gasped, her hand flying to her throat as she realized the trajectory of the moment had shifted permanently beyond her control. A sharp snap echoed as a lady of the court closed her fan with too much force. Arthur removed the coat, the ancient gold braid catching the light, bridging the final gap between their stations. He stepped forward and draped the ceremonial coat over Elena's shoulders. Its immense weight completely enveloped her. The charcoal wool was thick and warm, smelling of cedar and old parchment, hiding the red stain and the cheap sarcenet beneath a fortress of Beaumont gold. The rough texture of her thrifted dress was now cushioned by the finest weave in the country, a merging of the servant's labor and the master's protection. Elena felt the overwhelming warmth of the Duke's sanctuary. Looking down at the twin lions of the crest resting against her hands, the tremor in her fingers began to still. Without a spoken word of defense, his action was a declaration ringing louder than any shout. Inside her pocket, the legacy letter felt like a living thing, promising a restoration that none in the room could yet conceive. But the Duke was not finished. While the elite watched in paralyzed disbelief, Arthur slowly lowered himself, one knee touching the cold, wine-stained marble floor. The fluid, humble movement was a total subversion of every law of the social hierarchy. A duke was kneeling before a girl in cheap clothes, in the reverent posture of a man inspecting a holy relic. The sound of his knee hitting the floor was a physical blow to the pride of everyone standing in that room. Arthur reached out, his fingers touching the hem of the grey sarcenet gown, peeking out from beneath his coat. Ignoring the red wine staining his own white silk waistcoat, he felt the texture of the split stitches and the tension of the thread. He was searching for the structural truth of the garment. He felt the evidence of the labor that had gone into it, the hours in the attic with Clara, the single candle, and the quiet resilience of a woman who refused to be erased. He saw the microscopic punctures in the cloth where her needle had fought against the cheap weave and won. "I wonder," he whispered, his voice echoing in the absolute silence. "Who taught you the Beaumont knot? Who gave you the right to carry my mother's stitch on this rag?" He did not say the word with venom. He said it with profound wonder, as if looking at gold buried in a field of stones. He stayed on his knee, waiting for her to speak. The ballroom was no longer a place of gossip. It had become a chapel of quiet revelation. The maid's daughter held the keys to his family's lost piece, the missing link to Duchess Eleanor's artistic soul. Elena Vance looked down at him, her heart beating against the legacy letter. The silence between them was a bridge. He was not looking at her poverty. He was looking at her mind, her skill, and the heritage preserved in the darkness of the servant quarters. She felt the weight of his ceremonial coat on her shoulders, a shield of honor earned with every stitch. Taking a deep breath, the scent of the cedar wool gave her the strength to finally speak her truth. "I learned it from the woman who changed your mother's linens," Elena said, her voice steady and clear, carrying to the furthest corners of the room. "I learned it because the truth does not care for boutiques or bank ledgers. It only cares for the hands that are willing to do the work." Arthur Beaumont closed his eyes for a second, a single sharp intake of breath the only sign of the storm breaking inside him. He stood up slowly, still ignoring the wine on his clothes, and turned to face the ballroom. His hand remained on Elena's arm, anchoring her in the ordinary light and signaling to everyone present that she was under his absolute protection. The Vane sisters were no longer the center of the story. They were merely shadows shrinking from a truth they could not understand. Arthur's cold expression was a judgment that felt like a sentence for their cruelty. He had spent a lifetime navigating the quiet architecture of isolation, and tonight, the long years of shadows and hiding were finally over for good, replaced by a glaring illumination that laid every hidden truth bare for the world to see. Arthur Beaumont stood tall, his hand a steady, anchoring weight upon Elena Vance's arm. It was a silent command that the world, and the sharp-tongued wolves within it, must cease their circling. The gold-braided charcoal wool of his ceremonial coat still held the profound heat of his own body, a physical warmth that was now transferring to Elena's shivering frame. He shielded her not only from the damp, clinging chill of the spilled burgundy wine, but from the aggressive social coldness that had sought to freeze her out. He did not look at the elite guests who now whispered behind their painted fans, their previous cruelty stalling in their throats. He did not look at Celine Vane or her sister Lydia, who were rapidly diminishing into mere silhouettes of shrinking arrogance, their spiteful triumph evaporating into genuine dread. Instead, the Duke's piercing eyes were locked entirely onto the shimmering silver embroidery, peeking from beneath the heavy wool of his coat, his mind actively navigating the intricate map of a memory he had long thought was lost to the grave. The sprawling silence of the ballroom had drastically shifted from a collective weapon of exclusion into a heavy, suffocating vacuum of pure shock. Then, Arthur Beaumont did something that caused a ragged, collective intake of breath to echo against the gilded, vaulted ceiling of the Beaumont estate ballroom. Ignoring the wine-slicked marble floor, ignoring the certain ruin of his own impeccable formal trousers, and dismissing every unspoken rule of Regency hierarchy, the Duke descended slowly to one knee before the maid's daughter. He knelt not out of mockery or theatrical flourish, but with the profound, heavy reverence of a man who had finally discovered the missing cornerstone of his own fractured history. He remained there, his knee pressing deeply into the bitter, red dregs of the spilled wine, his focus entirely consumed by the silver threads at Elena's hem. The visual impact of a duke, brought low by his own respect for a commoner's hidden craft, was a sudden fracture in the established social order that no one present would ever manage to forget. The absolute, unshakable stillness of his posture was a damning judgment on everyone who had stood by and laughed. The vast room was held in an agonizing suspension, a collective breath trapped behind rigid corsets and starched cravats, establishing the room's freezing atmospheric pressure. "Look at the rhythm of the knots," Arthur murmured, his voice dropping into a register that felt like the steady, low vibration of old limestone. The sound cut through the heavy, perfumed air like a freshly honed blade slicing through cheap silk. He was speaking more to the lingering ghost of his mother than to the living girl trembling slightly beside him. "This is not merely decoration, it is a structural marvel." He reached out, his bare fingers hovering with earth, a breathless rents usually reserved for ancient, sacred altar cloths. He did not touch the fabric, but traced the precise geometry of the shimmering silver that Elena Vance had just maliciously tried to drown in red wine. This is the Beaumont knot, a lost technique involving a subterranean anchor stitch that allows the silver thread to catch the ambient light from every possible angle, regardless of the coarse quality of the base fabric. The Duke's eyes tracked the painstaking needlework, recognizing the immense discipline required to execute such a flawless design on a thrifted, $10 sarcenet gown without causing the brittle material to pucker or tear. It was a masterpiece of tension and restraint. "My mother, Duchess Eleanor, spent 30 years perfecting this precise sequence of thread and shadow," Arthur continued, his voice carrying the melancholic weight of a long-abandoned grief finally finding its resolution. "She used to tell me that the stitch required a specific atmospheric pressure of the soul, a quiet, unyielding patience that could only be forged in the isolation of true, meticulous labor. She claimed the thread had to be coaxed, not forced, guided by hands that understood the profound dignity of creating something entirely from scratch." He looked up then, his searching gaze abandoning the silver hem to finally meet Elena's wide, observant eyes. The reclusive Duke, a man who had spent the better part of a decade fortifying the quiet architecture of his own isolation, found himself violently confronted with the living, breathing evidence of his mother's most guarded legacy. "You did not just learn this from a woman who merely changed linens and swept the grates," Arthur said, the commanding certainty in his tone leaving no room for debate. "You have performed this intricate work with a mathematical precision that exceeds even the charcoal sketches she left behind in her private, locked ledgers. You are the protégé the Beaumont artistic estate has been desperately searching for since the candles burned low in my mother's study over 20 years ago. This modest dress, as these people so loudly and foolishly call it, carries more of my family's true history than the entirety of this grand ballroom combined." The elite guests shifted uneasily, a collective, nervous rustle of princely silk that sounded uncomfortably like the dry, brittle leaves of a dying forest. Elena Vance's face had completely drained of its vibrant, haughty color, leaving her expensive boutique sapphire satin looking like a garish mockery of her own suddenly pale features. She had sought to maliciously expose a maid's daughter, hoping to reinforce the rigid boundaries of their social sphere, but in doing so, she had accidentally dragged the most valuable, fiercely protected secret of the Beaumont house into the glaring light of the chandeliers. Arthur's intense focus returned to Elena, his eyes narrowing slightly as he sensed the formidable internal architecture of her resilience. He noted the permanent calluses on her fingertips, the small, pale scars near her knuckles that were the undeniable marks of 1,000 late nights spent mastering a forgotten art. It was the sudden, breathless reverence for the laborer's immense sacrifice, the undeniable realization that the most refined, priceless artistry in the room was being worn by the very woman they had just deemed entirely worthless. "I have spent 10 long years looking for the woman my mother affectionately called the guardian of the loom," Arthur continued, his voice steadying into an immovable pillar of absolute authority as he finally rose from the stained floor, completely ignoring the dark red wine now soaking the knee of his formal trousers. She left a distinct, ironclad provision in her final will, an annuity directly tied to the creative stewardship of the Beaumont artistic estate, strictly to be given to the one who could recreate the silver lavender motif without a formal guide. I was repeatedly told by scholars and peers alike that the technique had tragically died with her. I was told that the humble servants she had quietly befriended over the years were merely fleeting ghosts in her peripheral vision, incapable of carrying such an intellectual burden. He looked pointedly at the dark red stain blooming across Elena's chest, where the wine had utterly failed to unravel or ruin the structural integrity of the silver knots. Instead, I find that our proudest heritage was meticulously preserved in a cramped attic, mended with humble thread and fiercely guarded by the dignity of a woman who adamantly refused to let the historical light go out. Elena stood perfectly still in the absolute center of the grand ballroom, absorbing the immense gravity of the Duke's public declaration. She did not shrink back, nor did she offer a frantic, overly grateful apology for the disruption, as a lesser woman might have done under the crushing weight of so many staring eyes. Instead, she drew in a slow, measured breath, letting the steady warmth of Arthur's ceremonial coat ground her racing pulse. She felt the heavy gold braid brushing against her collarbone, a stark, physical reminder of the protection he had offered her, without a single moment of hesitation. The sheer social terror she had experienced only minutes ago, when Celine's glass had deliberately tipped, was entirely gone, replaced by a crystalline, unshakable clarity. The hollow, familiar weight of being overlooked and constantly diminished by those who wore their wealth, rather than earned it, simply evaporated, leaving behind a profound, justified strength. She recognized that her mocked, cheaply bought clothes had never been a mark of shame. They were a living ledger, a physical recording of her mother Clara's unwavering love and her own silent mastery. She looked directly at Arthur Beaumont, intentionally ignoring the frantic, whispering aristocracy that surrounded them. The Duke's steady, searching gaze offered no pity, only a vast, uncompromising respect that demanded absolute honesty in return. He had found the quiet clarity he had sought for a decade, and now he was patiently waiting for her to step fully into the light and claim her rightful place. "Your Grace," Elena finally said, her voice clear, rich, and remarkably unwavering, cutting effortlessly through the low, buzzing hum of the guests' mounting confusion. She did not raise her voice to an undignified shout, but the undeniable resonance of her words carried to the furthest corners of the vaulted room. "My mother, Clara Vance, did not just teach me how to pull a silver thread through cheap cloth to make it look passably pretty for a single night." She paused, letting her calm, observant eyes sweep briefly over the terrified, shrinking figure of Elena Vance, before bringing her full, unwavering attention back to the Duke. "She taught me the underlying mathematics of the loom. She taught me that the bones of a thing are what truly endure when the fragile silk has long faded and the superficial dyes have completely washed away. She was not a fleeting ghost in Duchess Eleanor's peripheral vision. She was her most trusted confidant, the absolute keeper of the quiet hours when the rest of the great house was asleep." Elena lifted her chin, the soft glow of the chandeliers catching the defiant spark in her eyes and illuminating the meticulous silver lavender blooming across her ruined bodice. She spent 20 years sweeping the grates and changing the linens by day, only to preserve the proprietary designs of your family's lineage by candlelight. She told me the true history of the Beaumont artistic estate, and she instructed me that when the time was right, and when the hands that held the needles were finally steady enough, I must step forward and return what was never truly ours to keep. Arthur Beaumont remained kneeling on the wine-stained marble, his posture a staggering violation of every social protocol the room held dear. He ignored the gasps of the onlookers, his focus narrowing entirely to the hem of the thrifted sarcenet gown. His calloused fingers, which knew the weight of limestone and the texture of ancient parchment, traced the intricate silver lavender blooming across the fabric. He was not looking at a stain. He was tracing the subterranean anchor stitches of the Beaumont knot, a technique he had thought buried in the quiet earth alongside mother. In that breathless silence, the Duke of Beaumont was a man rediscovered, his searching gaze finding the exact shape of a legacy he had feared lost. Slowly, Arthur rose to his full height, transitioning from a humble investigator into a silent, immovable sentinel. His presence seemed to absorb the frantic energy of the ballroom like a sponge soaking up a spill. The heavy, gold-braided charcoal wool of his ceremonial coat remained draped over Elena Vance's shoulders, providing a physical and metaphorical sanctuary that the rest of the room dared not breach. He let the final echoes of her words, the revelation that her mother, Clara, had been the secret guardian of the Beaumont artistic estate, settle into the gilded moldings. The elite guests, who only moments ago had been a unified front of mockery, now resembled brittle glass figures, terrified that the slightest movement would cause them to shatter. Arthur's attention finally settled on Elena Vance. The socialite stood frozen, her sapphire satin gown, a garment she had viewed as her armor, now appearing like a gauche, insubstantial costume against the profound gravity of the moment. Her face had turned the ashy color of spent embers. Lydia Vane, cowering behind her sister, clutched her painted silk fan so tightly that the delicate ivory ribs let out a sharp protest. The Duke did not raise his voice. He had no need for theatrical bellows. His authority was a subterranean thing, rooted in the very limestone of the estate and the centuries of integrity that Celine had just attempted to dismantle with a single glass of wine. It is a curious thing, the way some people mistake the price of a garment for the value of the soul wearing it, Arthur said, his voice a low vibration that settled in the marrow of everyone present. He took a deliberate step towards Celine, his movement fluid and predatory. You looked at this woman's clothes and saw a target for your boredom. You saw a maid's daughter and assumed she was a void where history should be. But in your haste to mock what you perceived as cheap, you exposed the utter poverty of your own upbringing. You looked at the embroidery on her sleeve and saw only a thrifted rag, while I saw the exact shape of my mother's devotion. He paused, the silence in the ballroom reaching the exact temperature of a frozen lake. My mother, the Duchess Eleanor, spent the final decade of her life in a silent, desperate search for a protégé worthy of the Beaumont knot, someone who understood the bones of the thing, not just the surface. Tonight, I have found the person she was looking for. This thrifted sarcenet contains more of the Beaumont history and soul than every gilded molding in this ballroom. You saw a stain, Celine, while I saw a legacy that your family, for all its boutiques and ledgers, could never have emptied to me. Celine attempted to speak, her lips moving in a frantic, silent stutter, but the words were dead before they could reach the air. The Duke's dismissal was absolute. True class is not a thing that can be purchased in London or imported from Paris, Arthur continued, his gaze narrowing as he addressed the wider room. It is woven into the character by the slow, difficult labor of integrity. It is found in the hands that mend what is broken, not the hands that seek to break what they do not understand. My mother understood this. She found more kinship in the quiet honesty of Clara Vance than she ever did in the hollow flattery of this ballroom. And tonight, you have proven her wisdom in the most disgraceful manner possible. The Duke turned his full attention back to Celine and Lydia, his expression hardening into a mask of granite. The Vane family has long enjoyed the patronage and the social standing afforded by the Beaumont name. You have sat at our tables and benefited from the prestige of our artistic estate. But that association ends tonight. It ends here in the shadow of the very cruelty you so proudly displayed. He looked past them toward his steward, who stood near the grand doors, already recording the silent sentence. Effective immediately, the Vane family's standing within the Beaumont estate is revoked in perpetuity. Your invitations to any future events are withdrawn, and your seats on our boards are forfeited. I will not have the bones of this house tainted by those who view character as a thing to be discarded for the sake of a laugh. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. To be banned by the Duke of Beaumont was a total erasure from the highest tiers of society. Celine's world, built on the shifting sands of status, was collapsing in real time. She stood in the center of the room, her sapphire satin no longer a symbol of power but a shroud of her own making. The Duke did not wait for her to leave. He simply turned his back on her, a dismissal so complete that it felt as though she had ceased to exist in the physical space of the ballroom. Arthur turned to Elena, his features softening. The transition from the cold observation of social cruelty to the warm, sensory-rich regard he held for her was a shift that the entire room felt like a change in the weather. He offered his arm, his fingers brushing the charcoal wool of the coat he had given her. The air in this part of the room has become quite thin, wouldn't you agree? He murmured, his voice now intended only for her. I believe it is time we moved to a table where the conversation is rooted in something more substantial than the price of silk. Elena took his arm, her fingers curling around the gold-braided sleeve. The weight of the ceremonial coat felt different now, less like a shield and more like a mantle. She felt the steady, rhythmic thud of the orchestra resuming, but the melody had changed. It was no longer a frantic performative swell, but a slow, dignified piece that paced itself to their steps. As Arthur led her away, the crowd parted like a dark sea before a beam of light. The same guests who had whispered and mocked only minutes ago now bowed their heads as they passed, their previous arrogance replaced by a frantic, wide-eyed deference. They walked across the marble floor, the red stain on Elena's dress still visible where the coat parted at her knees, but it no longer carried the sting of shame. It was a mark of the struggle, a record of the moment she had refused to be unseen. Arthur steered her toward the far end of the ballroom, where a single, long table was draped in white damask as thick and heavy as cream. This was the head table, the seat of honor reserved for the Duke's most intimate circle. The silver plates here were heirlooms, each one engraved with the Beaumont crest. As they reached the table, Arthur pulled out the heavy carved oak chair at the very center, the seat reserved for the guest of honor, a position that had remained empty all evening. The ballroom watched in a stunned silence as the Duke of Beaumont seated the maid's daughter. He leaned in, his hands resting on the back of the chair for a moment, his presence a fortress around her. "You have spent a lifetime learning the precise shape of being unseen, Elena," he whispered, his voice warm against the velvet air. "But tonight the light has finally found the enduring truth beneath. You are here because you are the only person in this room who truly knows what it means to build something that lasts." Elena sat down, the coolness of the silk-covered cushion and the weight of the silver, a sensory affirmation of her new reality. She looked out across the ballroom, seeing the faces of the elite from her new vantage point. From here, the gowns and the diamond collars looked fragile, almost transparent. She saw the Vane sisters being quietly escorted toward the grand doors by two silent footmen, their sapphire satin disappearing into the shadows of the foyer. The social hierarchy of the evening had been permanently upended by the undeniable power of competence and the courage to remain whole. The Duke took the seat beside her, his movements steady. He caught the eye of a waiter, who immediately stepped forward to fill Elena's crystal flute with cold, clear water. "We shall start with the restoration of the estate ledgers tomorrow morning," Arthur said, his tone shifting into the comfortable rhythm of shared work. "I believe there are several designs in my mother's private study that have been waiting for the right hands to bring them to life. I suspect Clara has already told you where the hidden keys are kept." Elena looked at him, the scent of cedar and old parchment from his coat still enveloping her. She realized then that the Duke had not fallen in love with her face, but with her mind, her skill, and the unyielding integrity that had allowed her to preserve his family's soul while the world ignored her. The slow-burn tension between them was now a foundational heat, a promise of a future built on mutual respect. "She told me," Elena murmured, a soft smile finally touching her lips. "She also told me that the most important designs are the ones that are never written down, the ones carried in the heart and executed with the hands of someone who truly cares for the craft." Arthur watched her, his gaze searching and deep. He had found the cornerstone of his world, and she was sitting right beside him in a $10 thrifted dress that was now the most valuable object in the opulent room, a testament to a quiet resilience that outshone every diamond present. Arthur Beaumont stood at the head of the long table, the white damask beneath his hands feeling like cold, pressed snow. The ballroom was so silent that the distant hiss of a candle burning low in its socket seemed to echo against the gilded cornices. Every face in the room, from the highest-ranking earl to the youngest debutante, was turned toward him with a mixture of terror and awe. Elena Vance sat beside him, the heavy wool of his ceremonial coat still draped over her shoulders, the gold braid catching the light in a rhythmic, undulating shimmer. She was no longer the invisible shadow from the attic. She had become the magnetic center of the Beaumont world. Arthur did not look at the guests with anger. That would have been too undignified, but with a cool, clinical observation that made the very air feel thin. He let the silence stretch until it possessed the exact temperature of an ice-locked river, a physical weight that demanded absolute attention. The history of this house has never been written in the ledgers of boutiques or the gossip of the ton, Arthur began, his voice carrying a resonant authority that seemed to vibrate in the crystal flutes on the table. It was written in the labor of those who understood that beauty is a discipline, not a purchase. My mother, the Duchess Eleanor, knew this better than anyone. She did not leave her legacy to those who simply wore her name. She left it to the one who could carry her craft. Tonight, the search for that steward has ended. He reached into the inner pocket of his waistcoat and produced a heavy, cream-colored parchment, the Beaumont seal already pressed into the wax. It was the formal appointment for the guardian of the loom, a document that carried with it the full weight of the estate's artistic annuity and the legal stewardship of its proprietary designs. He placed the parchment on the table before Elena, the sound of the heavy paper hitting the wood sharp and decisive. "Elena Vance is not a guest of honor for a single evening," he declared, his gaze sweeping the room with a terrifying clarity. "She is the officially recognized guardian of the loom. She will oversee the restoration of our archives, the management of our weaving looms, and the preservation of every design my mother entrusted to the shadows. Her authority in these matters is my authority. Her word on the integrity of our craft is law." A collective, staggered gasp rippled through the ballroom, a sound like the rustle of dead leaves in a winter wind. To elevate a maid's daughter to such a prestigious station was not merely a shock. It was a total dismantling of the social barricades they had spent centuries building. It was the ultimate poetic justice. The girl they had mocked for her cheap clothes was now the protector of the very heritage they all desperately sought to associate with. Arthur watched as the realization settled over the crowd. He saw the way the women who had whispered about Elena's thrifted sarcenet gown now looked at their own expensive silks with a sudden, gnawing doubt. They realized that their wealth was a transient surface thing, while the girl in the ruined dress held the foundation of the house in her hands. Elena reached out, her calloused fingers touching the edge of the parchment. The texture of the high-quality vellum was a sensory anchor, a physical confirmation that her years of silent labor in the attic had finally found their way into the ordinary light. She did not look at the guests. She looked at the Duke, and in the silence between them, there was a profound shared recognition of a truth that required no further explanation. The grand doors at the far end of the ballroom opened once more, but this time there was no orchestral fanfare. The sound was the rhythmic, steady click of sensible shoes against the marble, a sound that carried the weight of decades of service. Clara Vance walked into the light of the primary chandelier, her dark wool maid's uniform a stark, dignified contrast to the shimmering sea of pastel satin. She moved with the quiet, unyielding grace of a woman who had already weathered the worst the world could offer and had come out whole. The guests parted for her, their previous arrogance replaced by a frantic, wide-eyed deference that Clara ignored with the practiced ease of a woman who had spent 30 years looking at the truth, not the mask. As Clara reached the head table, Arthur Beaumont did something that caused the final vestiges of the old social order to crumble into dust. He stepped away from his own seat and walked toward the woman who had spent half her life changing his linens and polishing his silver. He did not offer her a nod of dismissal. He offered her his arm. "Clara," he said, his voice warm and devoid of the clinical coldness he had shown the peerage. "The guest of honor's mother has been in the shadows for far too long. I believe it is time the guardian of the loom took her rightful place at the center of the house she has spent 20 years protecting." He led her to the chair beside Elena, seating her with the same reverent care he had shown her daughter. The image was one that would be whispered about in every drawing room in London for a generation. The Duke of Beaumont, flanked by the maid and her daughter, seated at the head of the most powerful table in the country. It was a visual restoration of a stolen legacy, a physical map of a justice that had been long delayed but was now absolute. Clara sat down, the scent of starch and beeswax on her uniform clashing with the expensive jasmine of the room. But to Elena, it was the most beautiful scent in the world. It was the smell of home, of resilience, and of the quiet, fierce love that had fueled every stitch of the silver embroidery now hidden beneath the Duke's coat. "You look tired, Elena," Clara murmured, her voice a dry, comforting rustle that only her daughter could hear. "But you didn't drop the tension. You listened for the water." Elena reached beneath the table and took her mother's hand, the skin rough and mapped with the labor of a lifetime. The heat of the ballroom, the brilliance of the chandeliers, and the weight of the Duke's protection all seemed to fade into the background, leaving only this, the profound peace of being truly seen by the person who had always known her worth. The red stain on her dress was still there, a dark bruise against the grey silk, but it no longer felt like a mark of shame. It felt like a badge of honor, a record of the moment the storm had tried to break her and failed. The Duke stood beside them, his presence a fortress of quiet authority. He looked out over the ballroom, seeing the elite guests who were now struggling to find their own place in a world that had been fundamentally altered. "The gala is concluded," he announced, his voice cool and final. "The restoration begins at dawn. I suggest you all take the time to reflect on the difference between the price of a thing and its internal architecture." He did not wait for them to leave. He simply turned to Elena and Clara, signaling that the performative portion of the evening was over. The shadows were gone, and the light that remained was steady, warm, and entirely theirs. An hour later, the grand ballroom was empty, the hundreds of candles having burned down to small, sputtering pools of wax. The silence that filled the space was no longer the sharp, excluding silence of the elite, but the deep, contented quiet of a house that had been mended. Elena and Clara walked through the estate's moonlit gardens, the air smelling of damp earth and the first hints of night-blooming jasmine. Elena still wore the Duke's ceremonial coat, the heavy charcoal wool a comforting weight against the cool night air. Arthur walked a few paces behind them, his gaze fixed on the two women who had become the cornerstone of his new world. Elena stopped near a bed of wild lavender, the silver embroidery on her hem catching the pale light of the moon. She looked back at the limestone titan of the house, its windows now dark save for the library where a single candle still flickered. She realized then that her cheap clothes had never been a liability. They had been her strength. They carried the memory of the attic, the discipline of the needle, and the integrity of a mother who had refused to let a legacy die in the dark. She was no longer the maid's daughter hiding in the shadows. She was the architect of a future built on the truth. "It is a strange thing," Elena said, her voice a soft whisper in the garden's stillness. "To spend so long learning the shape of being unseen, only to realize that the most important things are the ones that don't need a crowd to be real." Arthur stepped forward, his eyes searching and deep as he looked at her. He didn't speak of love, not yet. Instead, he spoke of the work, and in that moment it was the same thing. "The internal structure of the house is finally mending, Elena," he said, the moonlight catching the architectural planes of his face. "And I suspect the designs we create tomorrow will be the most beautiful this estate has ever seen." They stood there in the quiet of the garden, the maid, her daughter, and the Duke, a trio brought together by the undeniable power of a silver thread and a mother's secret. The restoration was complete, and for the first time in her 20 years, Elena Vance felt the profound, unshakable safety of being exactly where she belonged. She had spent a lifetime learning the shape of being unseen. Now she stood in the ordinary light, finally witnessed. The sarcenet was no longer a ruin, and she was no longer a ghost. The loudest truths are often found in the quietest ledgers, and the most valuable things in a room are rarely the ones that cost the most. Tell me, have you ever felt the profound peace of finding your sanctuary in a place where you were once told you were worthless? Where is the ruin in your own life that you are currently mending with your own two hands? From which corner of the world are you listening to this story of quiet triumph tonight?